The funeral of Margaret Eleanor Whitmore was held on a gray October morning in Charleston, South Carolina. The old Episcopal church was filled to capacity with the city's prominent families, all dressed in black, all whispering about the woman who had just been laid to rest. Margaret had been 94 years old when she died. She'd been a fixture of Charleston society for 7 decades, a woman whose family name traced back to before the Civil War, whose grandfather had owned one of the largest plantations in the South, whose wealth and influence had shaped the city in ways both visible and hidden. But it wasn't Margaret's death that had the town talking. It was her will. In the third pew from the front sat a woman who didn't belong there, or so the whispers suggested. Clara Washington was 68 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and dark eyes that had seen more than most people could imagine. She wore a simple black dress, no jewelry except for a small gold cross around her neck. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she sat perfectly still, even as she felt the weight of dozens of stares boring into her back. Beside her, or rather, glaring at her from across the aisle, sat Richard Whitmore III. Margaret's only son. He was 70 years old, a large man with thinning white hair and a face reddened by anger and a lifetime of too much bourbon. His wife, Patricia, sat beside him, her thin lips pressed together in disapproval as she stared at Clara. The service was formal and brief. The minister spoke about Margaret's long life, her charitable work, her dedication to preserving Charleston's history. He mentioned her late husband, Richard Whitmore II, who had died 30 years earlier. He mentioned her son and grandchildren. He did not mention Clara, though everyone in the church knew why she was there. After the service, as the crowd moved to the cemetery for the burial, Richard approached Clara on the church steps. His face was twisted with rage barely contained by the social necessity of public decorum. "You've got some nerve showing up here," he hissed, keeping his voice low enough that only Clara could hear. "After what you've done. After what you've taken from my family." Clara met his eyes without flinching. "Your mother invited me to her funeral. I'm here to pay my respects to a woman I knew for 63 years. That's all." "Respected? Is that what you call it?" Richard's voice was rising, drawing attention from the people around them. "You manipulated a dying old woman. You poisoned her mind against her own family. And now you think you can just waltz in here and—" "Richard." Patricia grabbed her husband's arm, her own voice tight with controlled fury. "Not here. Not now. People are watching." Richard took a breath, but his eyes never left Clara's face. "This isn't over. We're contesting that will. You'll get nothing. Not 1 penny. I'll see to that." Clara said nothing. She simply turned and walked toward the cemetery, her back straight, her step steady. She'd known this was coming. Had known it from the moment Margaret's lawyer had read the will 2 weeks ago, in an office filled with shocked family members and gasping relatives. The will had been simple and clear. Margaret Eleanor Whitmore left her entire estate, including the historic family home, all financial assets, investments, and personal property, to Clara Marie Washington. To her son Richard, she left exactly $1 and a letter. The reading of that will have been the most devastating moment of Richard Whitmore's life. He'd shouted. He'd threatened. He'd accused Clara of elder abuse, manipulation, and fraud. His children had joined in, their faces twisted with outrage and greed. But Margaret's lawyer had been prepared. The will had been properly executed, witnessed by 3 independent parties, and accompanied by a psychological evaluation from 2 separate doctors confirming that Margaret had been of sound mind when she'd made these decisions. Still, Richard had promised to fight. And Clara knew he would. At the cemetery, Clara stood apart from the family, watching as Margaret's casket was lowered into the ground beside her husband's grave. The minister said final prayers. People took turns placing roses on the casket. When it was Clara's turn, she stepped forward with a single white rose, Margaret's favorite. She placed it gently on the polished wood, and for just a moment, her composure cracked. Tears slid down her cheeks as she whispered words only she and Margaret's memory could hear. "Thank you. For everything. I'll keep my promise." After the burial, there was a reception at the Whitmore family home, or what had been the Whitmore family home. Now, legally, it belonged to Clara, though she hadn't yet set foot inside as its owner. The house was a stunning antebellum mansion on the Battery, with white columns and wide verandas overlooking Charleston Harbor. It had been in the Whitmore family for 6 generations. Inside, the rooms were filled with antiques, oil paintings of ancestors, and the kind of old Southern wealth that most people only saw in movies. Clara arrived late to the reception, after most of the guests had already gathered. She walked through the front door, her front door now, though the thought still felt surreal, and immediately felt the shift in atmosphere. Conversation stopped. People turned to stare. The hostility was palpable. Richard stood near the fireplace, surrounded by his children and their spouses. When he saw Clara enter, his face darkened. "You have no right to be here," he said loudly, his voice carrying across the room. "This is my family's home. My mother's home." "It was your mother's home," Clara replied calmly. "And she invited me to this reception. I have the written invitation. My mother was not in her right mind when she wrote that invitation or when she signed that obscene will." Richard set down his drink and walked toward her, his bulk intimidating. "You took advantage of a sick, dying old woman. You isolated her from her family. You filled her head with lies and manipulated her into cutting out her own son." People around them had gone silent, watching the confrontation. Clara stood her ground. "Your mother was of sound mind until the day she died. She knew exactly what she was doing and why she was doing it. If you want to know why she left everything to me and nothing to you, maybe you should read the letter she left you." "I read the letter," Richard spat. "It was poison. Lies about the past, about things that never happened the way she claimed. She was confused, senile. She was clearer than she'd been in years," Clara interrupted, her voice still calm but with steel underneath. "And she remembered everything. Every truth you wanted to bury. Every secret you thought was safely hidden." Richard's face went from red to purple. For a moment, Clara thought he might actually strike her. But Patricia stepped between them, her voice sharp. "How dare you speak to my husband that way? You're a guest in this house." "I'm not a guest," Clara said quietly. "This is my house now. Margaret left it to me, along with everything else. And before you threaten me again or make any more accusations, you should know that I have documentation. Letters, journals, photographs. Your mother kept records of everything. She wanted the truth to come out, and she knew you'd fight me. So she made sure I had proof." The room was dead silent now. Everyone was staring at Clara with a mixture of shock, curiosity, and, in some cases, dawning understanding. "Proof of what?" Richard demanded. "What lies did she tell you?" Clara looked around the room, at all the prominent Charleston families gathered there. People who thought they knew the Whitmore family history. People who had no idea what had really happened in this house, in this family, over the past 63 years. "Your mother didn't tell me lies," Clara said. "She told me the truth. The truth about who I really am. The truth about what happened to my mother. The truth about the Whitmore family and how they built their fortune even after slavery ended." She paused. "And the truth about what you did, Richard, to keep all those secrets buried." Richard's expression changed. The anger was still there, but now there was something else too, fear. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice had lost some of its conviction. Clara reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. "Your mother wanted you to have this. She asked me to give it to you after the funeral, in front of witnesses." She held out the envelope. Richard stared at it like it was a snake. "What is that?" "The truth," Clara said simply. "The whole truth. Everything she knew. Everything she documented. Everything she wanted made public if you tried to contest her will or harm me in any way." Patricia grabbed the envelope before Richard could react. She tore it open and pulled out several pages, old letters, photocopies of documents, and a handwritten note from Margaret. As Patricia read, her face went white. "Richard," she whispered. "Richard, this says." "Shut up," Richard hissed, snatching the papers from her. He scanned them quickly, his hands shaking. These are forgeries. Lies. This is slander." "It's documented truth," Clara said. "With dates, witnesses, and corroborating evidence. Your mother spent the last 5 years of her life making sure everything was properly documented and verified. She worked with a private investigator, historian, and 3 different lawyers. Everything in that envelope can be proven." Richard looked up at Clara, and for the first time, she saw real fear in his eyes. "What do you want?" "I want what your mother wanted. Justice. Truth. And for the people who suffered because of this family's secrets to finally be acknowledged and honored." Clara's voice was steady, but there was emotion underneath it now. "I want what should have been mine all along. What should have been my mother's. What your family stole and buried and lied about for decades." "I don't understand," said one of the guests, an elderly woman who'd known the Whitmores for 50 years. "Clara, what are you talking about? What secrets?" Clara turned to face the room, these people who'd known her as Margaret's companion, her caretaker, her friend for over 6 decades. People who'd never questioned why Margaret kept Clara so close, why she trusted her with everything, why their bond had seemed so deep and so complicated. "My name is Clara Washington," she began, her voice carrying through the silent room. "I was born in this house in 1955. My mother's name was Rose Washington. She worked in this house as a domestic worker, that's what they called it then, though it was barely different from slavery in many ways. She was 16 years old when she started working here. 17 when she got pregnant." Clara paused. "And 18 when she died giving birth to me, right upstairs in the servants' quarters, while Margaret Whitmore held her hand and promised to take care of her baby." The room erupted in gasps and whispers. "That's a lie," Richard shouted. "My mother would never." "Your mother kept that promise," Clara continued, ignoring him. "She raised me alongside you, Richard. We played together as children. I was educated, cared for, loved. But I was never acknowledged as part of the family. Never given the Whitmore name. Never told the whole truth about who I was or who my father had been." She looked directly at Richard. "Not until Margaret knew she was dying and decided it was time for the truth to come out." "What truth?" Patricia demanded. "Who was your father?" Clara smiled sadly. "That's the question your mother-in-law spent her last years making sure was answered properly. With DNA evidence. With documentation. With legal proof that couldn't be denied or buried or explained away." She pulled another envelope from her purse, this one sealed and official-looking. "My father was Richard Whitmore II. Margaret's husband. Your father, Richard." Clara's voice was calm, but the words fell like bombs. "Which makes me your half-sister. Which makes this house half mine by right, though Margaret chose to leave me everything instead. Which makes the fortune you thought was yours actually part of my inheritance too." The room exploded in shocked exclamations and frantic whispers. Richard stood frozen, his face ashen. Patricia looked like she might faint. Clara stood in the center of it all, finally speaking the truth she'd known for 5 years, since the day Margaret had told her everything, had shown her the evidence, had apologized for a lifetime of secrets and asked Clara to help her make things right. "I didn't want this," Clara said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "I didn't want the money or the house or any of it. I wanted my mother's story told. I wanted the truth acknowledged. I wanted justice for Rose Washington and all the other women like her, women who worked in houses like this, who were exploited and used and then forgotten." She looked at Richard with something like pity. "Your mother understood that. She spent her last years trying to make amends for what her husband did, for what she'd helped hide. And she made sure that when she died, the truth would finally come out." Richard found his voice, though it shook with rage and fear. "You'll never prove this. Never. I'll fight you with every resource I have. I'll destroy you." "You'll try," Clara said quietly. "And you'll fail. Because your mother made sure of that. She knew you'd fight. She knew you'd try to bury the truth just like your father did. So she made sure everything was documented, verified, and protected. And she made sure that if you contest this will or try to harm me, all of it goes public. Every sordid detail. Every family secret. Every lie the Whitmore family has told for the past 68 years. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "The reception is over. This is my house now, and I'm asking all of you to leave. Richard, your belongings will be packed and sent to your address. You have 24 hours to remove anything personal you want to keep. After that, everything in this house belongs to me." As Clara walked out of the house she now owned, the house where she'd been born, where her mother had died, where she'd spent 68 years living a lie, she felt the weight of decades finally lifting from her shoulders. The fight wasn't over. Richard would contest the will, would hire expensive lawyers, would do everything in his power to destroy her. But Clara had something he didn't have. She had the truth. She had documentation. And she had Margaret's blessing and protection, reaching out from beyond the grave. The battle ahead would be hard. But Clara had survived harder things. She'd survived being born to a mother who died in childbirth. She'd survived growing up as neither family nor servant, accepted by neither world. She'd survived watching Richard be given everything while she was given scraps. She'd survived 68 years of secrets and lies. She could survive this too. And in the end, justice would be served. Her mother's story would be told. And the Whitmore family's carefully constructed lies would finally crumble into dust. The legal battle began exactly as Clara had expected, swift, vicious, and expensive. Within 24 hours of the funeral reception, Richard Whitmore's attorneys filed papers contesting the will. They claimed Margaret had been mentally incompetent, that Clara had exercised undue influence, and that the will was the product of elder abuse and manipulation. The papers were delivered to Clara at the Whitmore mansion, her mansion now, on a Monday morning. She sat in Margaret's study, the room where she'd spent countless hours reading to the older woman in her final years, and carefully reviewed each accusation. They were exactly what Margaret had predicted. Clara opened the safe hidden behind a painting of Charleston Harbor. Inside were the documents Margaret had prepared, medical evaluations from 3 different psychiatrists confirming her mental competency at the time the will was drafted. Letters written in Margaret's own hand explaining her decisions. And most importantly, the sealed files containing the truth about Clara's parentage and the Whitmore family's decades of secrets. But Clara knew documentation alone wouldn't be enough. She needed a lawyer who could navigate Charleston's complex social structure, who wouldn't be intimidated by the Whitmore name, and who would fight for justice rather than just a paycheck. She made a phone call to a number Margaret had given her months before she died. Morrison Law Firm, how may I help you? I need to speak with Jackson Morrison, Clara said. Tell him it's Clara Washington. He'll know what it's about. There was a pause, then, one moment please. Jackson Morrison was 56 years old, a former Navy JAG attorney who'd returned to Charleston after 25 years of military service. He'd built a reputation for taking cases other lawyers wouldn't touch, cases where powerful families tried to bury the truth, where justice was more important than maintaining social connections. He'd also served on the aircraft carrier where Clara's son had died 30 years earlier. But that was a connection Clara hadn't revealed yet. Some truths had to wait for the right moment. Clara Washington, Jackson's voice came through the line, warm but professional. Mrs. Whitmore told me you might be calling. I've been expecting your call since I heard about the will reading. Then you know what I'm up against. Richard Whitmore and his very expensive legal team trying to break a valid will because they don't like who inherited the money. Yes, I know. There was a pause. I also know what Margaret wanted me to tell you if you called. She wanted you to know that I'm aware of everything, all the documentation, all the evidence, and all the family history. She briefed me extensively before she died. And she retained my services specifically for this fight. Clara felt a wave of gratitude for Margaret's thoroughness. Even in death, the old woman was still protecting her. When can we meet? I'm free this afternoon. Come to my office at 2 o'clock. And Clara? Bring everything. All the documents, all the letters, everything Margaret gave you. We need to be prepared for war, because that's exactly what Richard is bringing. The Morrison law firm occupied a modest building in downtown Charleston, far from the prestigious addresses where the Whitmore family's attorneys had their offices. But when Clara walked in that afternoon, she immediately felt the difference between this place and the cold, corporate law firms she'd visited with Margaret over the years. This office felt real. The furniture was comfortable but not ostentatious. The walls displayed military commendations alongside law degrees. And Jackson Morrison himself was nothing like the smooth, silver-haired attorneys who usually represented Charleston's old families. He was tall and lean, with close-cropped gray hair and eyes that had seen combat and remembered it. He wore khakis and a button-down shirt rather than an expensive suit. And when he shook Clara's hand, his grip was firm and his gaze was direct. Thank you for coming, Mrs. Washington. Please, have a seat. Clara sat down and placed a leather portfolio on his desk, the portfolio Margaret had prepared, containing years of documentation. Before we begin, Jackson said, I want you to understand something. The Whitmores are going to fight dirty. They'll attack your character, they'll dredge up anything they can find from your past, and they'll try to paint you as a manipulative opportunist who took advantage of a vulnerable old woman. They have money, social connections, and generational power in this city. He leaned forward. But we have something they don't have. We have the truth. And we have Margaret's meticulous documentation of that truth. So the question is, are you prepared for how ugly this is going to get? Clara met his eyes without flinching. Mr. Morrison, I spent 68 years being treated as less than human by people who smiled at me in public while reminding me privately that I didn't belong in their world. I raised a son alone after his father, a Navy sailor, died before we could marry. I watched that son join the Navy himself, trying to prove something to a world that judged him for being born out of wedlock. And then I lost him when he was 22 years old in an accident at sea. Her voice was steady, but emotion ran underneath it. I buried my son, I cared for a woman who was trying to make amends for her husband's sins, and I've spent my entire life surviving things that would have broken most people. So yes, Mr. Morrison, I'm prepared for ugly. I've lived ugly. This is just a different kind. Jackson nodded slowly. Margaret told me about your son. Michael, right? He was a sailor on the USS Enterprise. Clara's breath caught. You knew him. I was the JAG officer who investigated the accident that killed him and 2 other sailors. Equipment failure during a training exercise. It should never have happened. Someone cut corners on maintenance inspections to save money. I wrote a report recommending court-martial for 3 officers in the chain of command. His face darkened. That report was buried. The officers were quietly transferred instead of prosecuted. The families of those 3 sailors never got real answers or real justice. Tears filled Clara's eyes. Michael was my only child. The only family I had left after my mother died and Margaret's husband died, and I realized I'd spent my whole life living half a life, accepted by no one. Margaret knew about Michael, Jackson said gently. She knew about the investigation and the cover-up. In fact, that's part of why she reached out to me specifically. She wanted me to know that she'd spent years trying to find out what really happened to your son, and she'd found evidence that Richard was involved in the cover-up. Clara froze. What? Jackson opened a file on his desk. Richard Whitmore served on the Navy Appropriations Committee during that time period. He had connections throughout the Navy Department. When the investigation into your son's death threatened to expose negligence by officers who had family connections to powerful politicians, including some of Richard's political allies, he made calls. He applied pressure. He helped bury the report that would have given you and the other families answers. He looked up at Clara. Margaret found documentation of all of this. She was horrified when she realized what her son had done. It was part of what motivated her to make things right, not just about your parentage, but about everything the Whitmore family had taken from you. Clara sat in stunned silence, processing this revelation. Richard hadn't just inherited a fortune that should have been partly hers. He hadn't just benefited from the lies about her mother's death and her father's identity. He had actively worked to cover up the truth about Michael's death, denying Clara even the cold comfort of knowing exactly what had happened to her son. I want justice, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. Not just the inheritance. Not just the acknowledgement of who I am. I want justice for Michael. I want the truth about what happened to him. And I want Richard to pay for every life he's ruined, every secret he's buried, every person he's hurt in his pursuit of power and respectability. Then let's make sure we win this case, Jackson said. Because once you're legally established as Richard's half-sister and the rightful heir to Margaret's estate, we can reopen the investigation into your son's death. We can bring everything into the light, all the cover-ups, all the corruption, all the connections Richard used to protect his allies and himself. He pulled out a legal pad. But first, we need to survive the will contest. Tell me everything, Clara. Start from the beginning. Tell me about your mother, about growing up in the Whitmore house, about Margaret's deathbed confession. I need to know every detail. For the next 3 hours, Clara told her story. She started with what Margaret had told her about Rose Washington, a young black woman from a poor family who'd gotten a job as a domestic worker in the Whitmore household in 1954. Rose had been beautiful, intelligent, and ambitious. She'd dreamed of becoming a teacher, of escaping the limited options available to black women in 1950s Charleston. Richard Whitmore too had been 45 years old, wealthy, powerful, and married to Margaret for 20 years. They had one son, Richard III, who was 15 years old when Rose Washington came to work in their house. What happened next was a story as old as the South itself. Richard II had forced himself on Rose. Not once, but repeatedly over the course of a year. Rose had been terrified to resist, afraid she'd lose her job, afraid she'd be accused of seducing him, afraid of what the white community would do to her if she spoke up. When Rose discovered she was pregnant, she tried to hide it. But Margaret had noticed. And Margaret, who'd spent 20 years married to a man she'd slowly realized was a monster, had made a choice that would define the rest of her life. She'd confronted her husband. She'd threatened to divorce him and expose him publicly, a threat that terrified Richard because divorce in 1950s Charleston society would have destroyed his reputation and his business connections. So they'd made a deal. Richard would never touch Rose again. Margaret would arrange for Rose to receive the best medical care available. The baby would be born in the Whitmore house, delivered by a private doctor who could be trusted to keep secrets. And if Rose died, as she tragically did from complications during childbirth, Margaret would raise the baby as her own. But there were conditions. The baby would never be acknowledged as Richard's child. Never given the Whitmore name. Never treated as equal to Richard III. The child would be raised in the house but not of the house, educated but not entitled, cared for but never fully claimed. Margaret had agreed to these terms because she believed it was the only way to protect Clara. She believed that giving Clara a stable home, even one where she was treated as something between family and servant, was better than sending her to foster care or an orphanage where she'd face worse treatment. For years, I thought Margaret was kind to me out of simple decency, Clara told Jackson. I thought she kept me close because she felt responsible for my mother's death. I didn't know the whole truth until 5 years ago, when Margaret knew she was dying and finally told me everything. What prompted her to finally tell you? Jackson asked. She fell and broke her hip. She was 90 and suddenly facing her own mortality. And she said she couldn't die with all these secrets still buried. Clara's voice softened. She told me about my father. She showed me the DNA test she'd secretly conducted. She'd saved a hairbrush of Richard II for decades, kept it hidden in her personal things. When DNA testing became available, she'd had it tested against my DNA. The match was conclusive. Did Richard know? Your half-brother. Margaret never told him while his father was alive. She kept her promise to Richard II in that respect. But after Richard II died in 1993, Margaret began to change her will. She started documenting everything, gathering evidence, building a case. And yes, she told Richard III about 5 years ago, right after she told me. She gave him a chance to acknowledge the truth, to make amends, to do the right thing. And he refused. Worse than refused. He threatened her. Threatened to have her declared mentally incompetent if she ever made this information public. Threatened to institutionalize her. Threatened to destroy me if I tried to claim any connection to the Whitmore family. Clara's hands clenched. He said his father had made a mistake with a servant girl, and that mistake didn't deserve to inherit anything or be acknowledged as family. He said I should be grateful for the life Margaret had given me and leave well enough alone. Jackson made notes on his legal pad. That threat is important. We can use that. Threatening to institutionalize someone to control their assets is exactly the kind of behavior that undermines his claims that Margaret was incompetent or that you manipulated her. There's more, Clara said. She pulled out a small recording device from her purse. Margaret recorded their conversation. She knew he'd threaten her, so she made sure to document it. It's all here, his threats, his refusal to acknowledge me, his contempt for his own mother's wishes. Everything. Jackson's eyes widened. This is gold. This destroys his entire case. Margaret was thorough. She spent 5 years building this case, knowing that when she died, Richard would fight. She protected me every way she could. Clara's voice broke slightly. She said she'd spent 68 years being a coward, letting her husband's sins be buried, letting me live half a life. She said that making things right was the only way she could face my mother when she died. They spent the rest of the afternoon going through documents, birth certificates, DNA test results, letters Margaret had written documenting the history, financial records showing years of payments Margaret had made to fund Clara's education and living expenses. Everything was meticulously organized and legally sound. "This is one of the most thoroughly documented cases I've ever seen," Jackson said. Margaret didn't leave anything to chance. She knew exactly what Richard would claim and she prepared evidence to counter every argument. "Will it be enough?" Clara asked. "In court?" "Yes. The evidence is overwhelming." "But Clara, you need to understand something. Charleston is a small city where family connections matter. The Whitmores have influence with judges, with society, with the media. Even if we win legally, and I'm confident we will, you're going to face social ostracism, harassment, and people who'll side with Richard simply because he's the known quantity and you're the outsider claiming to be something you've never been publicly acknowledged as before." "I've been an outsider my entire life," Clara said quietly. "At least now I'll be an outsider telling the truth." Over the next 2 weeks, the legal battle intensified. Richard's attorneys filed motion after motion, attempting to delay the will execution, demanding psychiatric evaluations of Clara, requesting investigations into elder abuse. Each motion was more desperate than the last, and each one was denied as Jackson systematically presented Margaret's documentation. But Richard wasn't just fighting in court. He was fighting in the court of public opinion. Articles began appearing in Charleston newspapers questioning Clara's background. Anonymous sources suggested she'd isolated Margaret from her family in her final years. Letters to the editor claimed it was suspicious that Margaret's maid had suddenly been left an entire fortune. The use of the word maid was deliberate and cruel. Clara had never been Margaret's maid, she'd been her companion, her friend, her confidant. But the word reduced her to a servant, implying that she'd somehow manipulated her employer into leaving her money. Clara received threatening phone calls. Someone spray-painted "thief" on the front gate of the Whitmore mansion. She found notes in her mailbox warning her to leave Charleston or face consequences. Through it all, she remained steady. She'd survived worse than social ostracism and anonymous threats. She'd buried her mother, raised her son alone, lost him to an accident that should never have happened, and spent 68 years living in a house where she was neither family nor servant. She could survive this too. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a gray November morning. Clara arrived at the courthouse with Jackson, prepared for a long legal battle. But what she wasn't prepared for was the crowd. Dozens of people stood outside the courthouse, some holding signs supporting Richard, "Protect Charleston Families." "Stop Estate Fraud," others supporting Clara, "Truth and Justice." "Margaret's will should stand." The second group surprised Clara. She'd expected to face this alone, with only Jackson and the truth on her side. But as she looked closer at the supporters, she recognized faces, members of the veteran support groups she'd volunteered with over the years, families of other sailors who died in military accidents, people from the black community who'd known her mother or heard Clara's story. An elderly black woman stepped forward from the crowd. "Clara Washington, we're here for you. We're here for Rose. We're here for truth and justice." Clara felt tears sting her eyes, but she kept walking toward the courthouse, her back straight and her head high. Inside the courtroom, the battle began in earnest. Richard's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Gerald Thompson who'd represented the Whitmore family for 40 years, made his opening argument with theatrical outrage. "Your Honor, this case represents one of the most egregious examples of elder abuse and undue influence I've encountered in my entire career. Mrs. Margaret Whitmore was a 94-year-old woman in declining health, isolated from her family by Ms. Washington, who systematically manipulated her into disinheriting her only son and leaving everything to herself. This will is a fraud, and we intend to prove it." Jackson stood to respond, and his voice was calm but powerful. "Your Honor, what Mr. Thompson calls manipulation, the evidence will show was actually a dying woman's attempt to right the wrongs of a lifetime. Margaret Whitmore was not confused or incompetent. She was clear-minded, documented her decisions extensively, and left behind overwhelming evidence that her will reflects her true wishes based on truths about her family that Mr. Thompson and his client would prefer remain buried. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Sarah Mitchell, looked between the two attorneys. This court will determine the validity of Mrs. Whitmore's will based on evidence, not rhetoric. Mr. Morrison, I understand you have substantial documentation to present? We do, Your Honor. Including medical evaluations, recordings, letters, and DNA evidence that will explain exactly why Mrs. Whitmore made the decisions she did. Gerald Thompson's face paled slightly. DNA evidence, Your Honor. This is the first I'm hearing of any such evidence. Because your client has been fighting to prevent the truth from coming out, Jackson replied. But Mrs. Whitmore ensured that truth would be revealed in this courtroom, whether her son approved or not. Judge Mitchell leaned forward. Mr. Morrison, are you saying there's more to this case than a simple will contest? Yes, Your Honor. This case involves family secrets going back 68 years, including questions of parentage, inheritance rights, and the systematic concealment of Clara Washington's true relationship to the Whitmore family. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Richard shot to his feet. This is outrageous. My attorney was not informed of any such claims. Sit down, Mr. Whitmore, Judge Mitchell said sharply. Mr. Thompson, did you know about these additional claims? Gerald Thompson looked genuinely shocked. No, Your Honor. My client informed me this was a straightforward case of undue influence and elder abuse. Then perhaps your client hasn't been entirely honest with you, Jackson said. Because the evidence we're about to present will show that Clara Washington is not simply Margaret Whitmore's former companion. She's Richard Whitmore III's half-sister. And the estate she inherited wasn't just a gift from a grateful employer, it was partial restitution for a lifetime of denial, concealment, and injustice. The courtroom exploded in shocked exclamations. The judge banged her gavel, calling for order. Richard's face had gone from red to ashen. Patricia looked like she might be sick. And Clara sat quietly in her seat, watching as the truth she'd kept secret for 68 years finally began to come into the light. The battle had truly begun. And whatever happened next, there was no going back. The courtroom slowly quieted under Judge Mitchell's stern gaze. She looked at Jackson with a mixture of surprise and interest. Mr. Morrison, these are serious claims. I assume you have substantial evidence to support them? We do, Your Honor. We have DNA evidence, birth records, witness testimony, and extensive documentation prepared by Margaret Whitmore herself. We also have recordings of conversations between Mrs. Whitmore and her son that will demonstrate why she made the decisions she did regarding her will. Gerald Thompson stood, his composure cracking. Your Honor, I request an immediate recess. My client and I need time to review this new information and prepare a response. Denied, Judge Mitchell said firmly. Your client filed this contest claiming Mrs. Whitmore was incompetent and that Ms. Washington exercised undue influence. Mr. Morrison is presenting evidence directly relevant to Mrs. Whitmore's state of mind and motivations. We'll proceed. She turned to Jackson. Present your evidence, Counselor. Jackson began methodically. First, he introduced Margaret's medical evaluations, 3 separate psychiatric assessments conducted over the 2 years before her death, all confirming her mental competency. The doctors testified via video deposition, each stating unequivocally that Margaret had been clear-minded, understood the implications of her decisions, and had expressed consistent wishes regarding her estate. Then came the DNA evidence. Jackson called a genetics expert who explained the testing process and results. The DNA samples, one from Richard Whitmore II's preserved hairbrush, one from Clara Washington, showed a probability of paternity exceeding 99.9%. This evidence conclusively demonstrates that Richard Whitmore II was Clara Washington's biological father, the expert testified. The genetic markers are unmistakable. Richard stood up, his voice shaking. This is a fabrication. How do we know that hairbrush actually belonged to my father? How do we know these samples weren't contaminated or manipulated? Mr. Whitmore, sit down or I'll have you removed from this courtroom, Judge Mitchell warned. You'll have your chance to present evidence. Right now, you'll remain quiet. Jackson then introduced letters, dozens of them, written by Margaret over the final 5 years of her life. In these letters, addressed to her attorney, her doctors, and to Clara herself, Margaret detailed the full history of Rose Washington's employment in the Whitmore household, Richard II's abuse of Rose, Clara's birth, and the decades of secrets that followed. One letter, dated just 6 months before Margaret's death, was particularly damning. I have lived with this guilt for 68 years. I made a deal with my husband to protect Clara, but in protecting her, I also denied her the truth about who she was. I denied her the family connection she deserved. I allowed her to grow up as neither family nor servant, accepted fully by no one. I told myself I was being kind, but I was really being a coward. I was protecting my husband's reputation, my family's standing, and my own position in Charleston society. And Clara paid the price for my cowardice, Now I am dying, and I cannot face my death without trying to make things right. Clara deserves to inherit what should have been partly hers all along. She deserves to have her mother's story told. She deserves justice for a lifetime of being treated as less than she was. And my son needs to face the truth about his father and about the privilege he's enjoyed his entire life at Clara's expense, I know Richard will fight this. I know he'll claim I was incompetent or manipulated. But I am neither. I am simply a woman trying to do right after a lifetime of doing wrong. And I pray that justice will prevail. The courtroom was silent as the letter was read aloud. Several people in the gallery were crying. Even Judge Mitchell looked moved. Jackson then played the recording Margaret had made of her conversation with Richard 5 years earlier, when she'd first told him about Clara's parentage and her intention to change her will. Margaret's voice came through clearly, strong despite her age. Richard, I'm telling you this because you have a right to know before I die. Clara is your half-sister. Your father assaulted her mother and got her pregnant. Rose died giving birth to Clara, and I've spent 68 years keeping this secret. But I'm not taking it to my grave. Clara deserves to be acknowledged. She deserves part of this family's inheritance. And I'm changing my will to reflect that. Richard's response was just as clear, you're insane. My father would never have touched a servant. And even if he did, that doesn't make her illegitimate child part of this family. You will not disgrace the Whitmore name by acknowledging some maid's daughter as my sister. If you try to do this, I'll have you declared incompetent. I'll have you institutionalized. I'll make sure you spend your final years in a facility where you can't do any more damage to this family's reputation. Margaret's reply was steady, then you've shown me exactly why you don't deserve to inherit anything. You're just like your father, more concerned with reputation than with doing what's right. I'm changing my will, Richard. And I'm documenting everything. If you try to fight it, all of this comes out. All the secrets. All the lies. Everything your father did. Everything I helped hide. All of it. The recording ended. The courtroom was completely silent. Judge Mitchell looked at Richard with open disgust. Mr. Whitmore, you threatened to institutionalize your own mother to prevent her from exercising her legal right to distribute her estate as she saw fit? Richard's attorney tried to intervene. Your Honor, that conversation was taken out of context. It was recorded with full context, Jackson interrupted. We have the complete conversation, all 90 minutes of it. Would you like to hear more? Gerald Thompson looked at his client, and Clara could see the moment when the attorney realized he'd been lied to. Your Honor, I request a recess to consult with my client. Denied. We're going to finish hearing this evidence today. Judge Mitchell turned to Jackson. Continue, Mr. Morrison. Jackson called Clara to the stand. As she walked to the witness box, she felt the weight of 6 decades of secrets finally being lifted. She was sworn in and sat down, her hands folded calmly in her lap. Ms. Washington, Jackson began gently, please tell the court about your early life in the Whitmore household. Clara took a breath and began her testimony. She described growing up in a house where she was neither family nor servant. She'd been given good food, nice clothes, and an excellent education. Margaret had insisted on that. But she'd never been acknowledged as Richard's sister, never invited to family events, never introduced as anything more than Margaret's ward. I loved Margaret, Clara said, her voice steady. She was kind to me, especially after her husband died. But there was always this distance, this barrier I didn't understand. I thought it was because of race. I was black, they were white, and this was Charleston in the 1950s and 60s. I thought Margaret was doing her best in a racist society, giving me opportunities most black children didn't have. When did you learn the truth? 5 years ago. Margaret called me to her bedroom. She was 90, and she'd just fallen and broken her hip. She told me she was afraid of dying with all these secrets still hidden. And then she told me everything, about my mother Rose, about what Richard Whitmore II had done to her, about my birth, about the deal Margaret had made to protect me while also protecting her husband's reputation. How did you feel when you learned this? Clara's voice wavered slightly. I felt betrayed. Angry. Sad. I'd spent 68 years not knowing who I really was. Not knowing that Richard III was my brother. Not knowing that the man I'd called Mr. Whitmore was actually my father, a father who'd assaulted my mother and then never acknowledged me. She paused. But I also felt compassion for Margaret. She'd been trapped too, in her own way. She'd done what she thought was right at the time, and she'd spent the rest of her life trying to make amends. Tell the court about your son, Michael. Clara's composure cracked. Tears filled her eyes. Michael was my only child. His father was a Navy sailor who died before we could marry, so Michael grew up without a father, just like I did. He joined the Navy when he was 18, wanting to make something of himself. And he died in an accident when he was 22. Equipment failure during a training exercise. They told me it was just bad luck, that these things happen. But it wasn't just bad luck, was it? No. Margaret told me 5 years ago that she'd investigated Michael's death. She'd discovered that there was negligence involved, officers who'd cut corners on safety inspections to save money. There was supposed to be an investigation, but it was buried. And her son, my half-brother Richard, had helped bury it. He'd used his political connections to protect the officers involved because they had connections to his political allies. Jackson introduced the documents Margaret had compiled about Michael's death, the original accident report, the suppressed investigation findings, and records of phone calls Richard had made to Navy officials in the weeks after Michael's death. So not only did Richard refuse to acknowledge you as his sister, Jackson said, he also helped cover up the truth about your son's death. Yes, Clara said, her voice stronger now. He took everything from me. My identity, my family connections, and finally, justice for my son. That's why Margaret left everything to me, not to punish Richard, but to give me back something of what his family had taken from me. Gerald Thompson cross-examined Clara, trying to suggest she'd manipulated Margaret or coerced her into making these claims. But Clara remained calm and consistent, and her testimony was backed up by overwhelming documentation. The hearing lasted 3 more days. Jackson called witnesses who'd known Rose Washington and could testify to her employment in the Whitmore household. He called Margaret's doctors, her attorney, and the private investigator she'd hired to document everything. Richard's attorneys tried to fight back, but their case was crumbling. They suggested the DNA evidence could have been faked, but the testing lab was reputable and accredited. They suggested Margaret had been senile, but 3 independent psychiatrists testified otherwise. They suggested Clara had isolated Margaret from her family, but witnesses testified that Richard had rarely visited his mother in her final years, while Clara had been there daily, caring for her with genuine love and devotion. On the 4th day, Gerald Thompson requested a private meeting with Jackson and the judge. In chambers, away from the courtroom, the attorney's professional mask finally slipped. "My client didn't tell me the full story," he admitted. "I didn't know about the DNA evidence or the recordings or any of this." He presented this as a simple case of a maid manipulating an elderly woman. "I would never have taken this case if I'd known the truth." Judge Mitchell's expression was cold. "Then you've learned an important lesson about clients who lie to their attorneys. Mr. Morrison, does Ms. Washington wish to proceed with the hearing, or would she consider a settlement?" Jackson looked at Clara, who'd been sitting quietly through this meeting. "Clara, it's your decision. We can keep fighting, or—" "I want to finish the hearing," Clara said firmly. "I want the full judgment from the court. I want it on the record that Margaret's will was valid, that she was competent, and that I didn't manipulate her. I want the truth officially recognized." Judge Mitchell nodded approvingly. "Then we'll reconvene tomorrow for closing arguments and judgment." That night, Clara returned to the Whitmore mansion, her mansion now, though the thought still felt strange. She walked through the rooms where she'd spent her entire life, seeing them differently now. This was the parlor where her mother had worked, dusting furniture and serving tea to Margaret's society friends. This was the staircase where Clara had played as a child, never quite comfortable being in the family spaces but not relegated to the servants' quarters either. This was the study where Margaret had spent her final years writing letters, documenting history, trying to make amends. Clara found herself in her old bedroom, the room she'd occupied for 68 years, comfortable but not luxurious, located in a wing of the house between the family bedrooms and the servants' quarters. A room that perfectly symbolized her position in the household, neither family nor servant, belonging nowhere, claimed by no one. She sat on the bed and allowed herself to cry. Not from sadness, though there was sadness. Not from anger, though there was anger too. But from release, the release of finally being able to tell her truth, her mother's truth, after a lifetime of secrets. Her phone rang. It was Jackson. "Clara, I wanted to check on you. Today was intense. I'm okay. Tired, but okay. You did well on the stand. Your testimony was powerful and credible. I think we're going to win this." "I know. But winning feels complicated. I'm about to officially become Richard's sister, but we'll never have a real relationship. I'm inheriting a fortune, but it can't bring back my mother or my son. Justice is being served, but it doesn't erase 68 years of lies." Jackson was quiet for a moment. "No, it doesn't erase the past. But it acknowledges the truth. It validates your mother's experience and your experience. And it ensures that Richard can't continue to benefit from his family's lies while you remain in the shadows. That matters, Clara. It really does matter." After they hung up, Clara walked to Margaret's study. She opened the safe and pulled out one final document, a letter Margaret had written to Clara, to be opened after the hearing was over. My dear Clara. If you're reading this, then the truth has come out. The hearing is over, and whatever judgment was rendered, at least the lies are no longer hidden in darkness. I cannot apologize enough for the lifetime of pain my silence caused you. I told myself I was protecting you, but I was really protecting my husband's reputation and my own position in society. I was a coward when I should have been brave. I hope that leaving you my estate brings you some measure of justice. But more than that, I hope it brings you peace. You were denied so much, your true family name, your connection to your father, acknowledgement from your brother. You were denied justice for your mother and for your son. I cannot give you back what was taken, but I can give you the means to build a new life, free from the limitations that were imposed on you. Use this inheritance however you wish. Build something beautiful. Help others who've been denied their truth. Or simply live the life you deserve, finally free from the secrets and lies that bound you for so long. I loved you, Clara. Not perfectly, not even honestly for most of your life. But I did love you. And my greatest regret is that I didn't have the courage to claim you as family when it mattered. Go forward in truth. Live freely. And know that your mother would be proud of the woman you've become. With love and profound regret. Margaret. Clara folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the safe. Margaret's words brought comfort, but also pain. The old woman had tried to make amends, but some things couldn't be undone. The next morning, Clara returned to the courthouse for closing arguments. The courtroom was packed, word had spread about the case, and people wanted to witness the conclusion. Gerald Thompson's closing argument was brief and half-hearted. He suggested that even if Margaret's will was legally valid, it was morally questionable to disinherit a son completely. But his heart wasn't in it, and everyone could tell. Jackson's closing argument was powerful. He reviewed the evidence, the documentation, and the clear testimony that Margaret had been competent and acting on her own free will. He spoke about justice delayed for 6 decades finally being served. And he spoke about Clara's dignity in the face of a lifetime of denial and lies. Clara Washington didn't ask to be born into this situation, Jackson concluded. She didn't ask to be the daughter of a rapist and a victim. She didn't ask to grow up in a house where she belonged nowhere. She didn't ask to lose her son because powerful men covered up negligence. But she survived all of it with grace and strength. And now she's asking only for what should have been hers all along, acknowledgement, justice, and the inheritance that represents her mother's stolen life and her own denied identity. This court has the power to grant her that justice. I urge you to do so. Judge Mitchell didn't even recess to consider her judgment. She looked directly at Clara and spoke. I've been a judge for 23 years, and I've seen many cases that revealed ugly family secrets. But few have been as thoroughly documented or as clearly justified as this one. Clara Washington, the evidence overwhelmingly supports your claims and validates Margaret Whitmore's decisions regarding her estate. She turned to Richard, her voice sharp with contempt. Mr. Whitmore, your behavior throughout this process has been reprehensible. You threatened your mother, you denied your sister, you helped cover up negligence that cost her son his life, and you lied to your own attorney about the facts of this case. You deserve exactly what your mother left you, $1 and the knowledge that your actions had consequences. Judge Mitchell turned back to Clara. This court finds that Margaret Eleanor Whitmore was of sound mind when she executed her will. The will is valid and will be enforced as written. Ms. Washington, the estate is yours. Furthermore, I'm ordering that all documentation regarding Michael Washington's death be unsealed and turned over to Ms. Washington and Mr. Morrison. If there's evidence of criminal negligence or cover-up, those responsible should be held accountable. The courtroom erupted in applause from Clara's supporters. Richard sat frozen, his face ashen. Patricia was crying quietly beside him. Clara sat very still, letting the judgment sink in. She'd won. Not just the legal battle, but something more important, official recognition of her truth, her mother's truth, and the beginning of justice for her son. As she left the courtroom, supported by Jackson and surrounded by well-wishers, Clara caught Richard's eye one final time. He looked broken, destroyed by the exposure of truths he'd fought so hard to keep buried. Clara felt no triumph in his downfall, only sadness for the family connections that could have been, for the brother she'd never truly had, for the lifetime of denial that had poisoned them both. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions. Clara paused on the steps, looking at the cameras and the crowd. "I have only one thing to say," she began, her voice clear and strong. "This case was never about money or revenge. It was about truth. My mother Rose Washington deserves to have her story told. She was a victim who died far too young, and her memory deserves to be honored. I hope that by bringing this truth into the light, other families will find the courage to confront their own hidden histories and to acknowledge the people who've been denied, dismissed, and erased from family stories. Truth matters. Justice matters. And it's never too late to make things right." As she walked down the courthouse steps toward her new life, a life where she was finally, officially, legally acknowledged as Clara Washington, daughter of Rose Washington and Richard Whitmore II, sister of Richard Whitmore III, and rightful heir to the Whitmore fortune, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in her entire 68 years. She felt free. Free from secrets. Free from lies. Free from the half-life she'd lived for so long. The battle was over. Justice had been served. And Clara Washington's truth had finally been told. 3 months after the court judgment, Clara stood in the parlor of the Whitmore mansion, watching as workers carefully removed paintings and furniture. She'd decided to turn the house into a museum and community center, a place that would tell the true history of Charleston, including the stories that had been buried for generations. "Ms. Washington?" A young woman approached with a clipboard. Jennifer Cole was a historian from the local university, one of several experts Clara had hired to help document and preserve the mansion's history. "We found something in the attic. I think you need to see this." Clara followed Jennifer up 3 flights of stairs to the attic, a space she'd rarely visited during her years living in the house. Dust motes floated in the light from the dormer windows, and old trunks and boxes were stacked in the corners. Jennifer led her to an old leather trunk, its contents already spread out on a nearby table. "These are letters. Dozens of them. They appear to be correspondence between your mother Rose and someone else, someone she was involved with before she came to work here." Clara's breath caught as she picked up one of the letters, written in faded ink on yellowed paper. Asterisk, "My dearest Rose. I know your family doesn't approve, but I love you more than anything in this world. When I finish my army service and come home, we'll be married. I don't care what anyone says. I'm going to spend the rest of my life making you happy. Yours always. James Asterisk." Clara's hands trembled. "My mother was in love with someone. Before she came here. Before." Jennifer nodded gently. "There are about 40 letters here, spanning several years. It appears James was an army soldier deployed overseas. The last letter is dated 2 months before your mother started working at this house." Clara read through the letters with tears streaming down her face. They told a story she'd never known, of a young woman deeply in love, waiting for her soldier to come home, making plans for their future together. The final letter was different in tone. Asterisk, "Rose. I don't understand why you won't answer my letters. I've written 6 times since I got home. Did something happen? Did you change your mind about us? Please write back. I need to know you're okay. James, asterisk. There were no letters after that one. She stopped responding to him, Clara said quietly. Right around the time she got pregnant with me. She stopped writing to the man she loved because of what Richard Whitmore did to her. Jennifer pulled out a newspaper clipping that had been tucked in with the letters. It was a death notice from 1956, a year after Clara's birth. Asterisk, James Henry Coleman, age 24, died in a car accident on Highway 17. Survived by his parents, asterisk. He died a year after your mother did, Jennifer said softly. I did some research. After Rose stopped responding to his letters, he apparently became despondent. The accident report suggests he'd been drinking. Some people who knew him said he never recovered from losing her, he didn't know she'd died giving birth. He thought she'd just stopped loving him. Clara sat down heavily on an old chair, the weight of this new tragedy overwhelming her. Her mother had been in love. She'd had plans, dreams, a future with a man who truly cared for her. And then Richard Whitmore had destroyed all of that, and both Rose and James had died within a year, their love story ended by violence and grief. There's more, Jennifer said hesitantly. I found Rose's diary. She handed Clara a small leather-bound journal. Clara opened it with shaking hands and began to read her mother's words written 19 years before Clara was born, describing her hopes and fears and dreams. The early entries were full of joy, descriptions of James, their plans to marry, her excitement about building a life with him. But then the tone changed. Entries became sporadic, the handwriting less steady. And then Clara found the entry that explained everything. Asterisk, March 15, 1955. I can't tell James. I can't tell anyone. Mr. Whitmore said if I say anything, he'll make sure I never work in this city again. He'll tell people I tried to seduce him, that I'm lying, that I'm trying to extort money from his family. No one will believe me. I'm just a colored girl who works in a white man's house. Who will take my word over his, asterisk. Asterisk, I thought Mrs. Whitmore might help me. But when I tried to tell her, she just looked away. She knows what her husband is like, but she won't stop him. She won't protect me, asterisk. Asterisk, I should leave. I should go to James and tell him everything. But I'm so ashamed. How can I face him now? How can I marry him knowing what's been done to me? He deserves better than someone who's been. I can't even write the word, asterisk. Asterisk, I'm trapped. If I leave, I'll lose my job and have no way to support myself. If I stay, this will happen again. There's no way out. Asterisk. Clara read through tears as her mother's entries became more desperate, more hopeless. Rose had stopped eating properly. She'd become depressed. And when she discovered she was pregnant, the entries stopped altogether for 2 months. The final entry was dated a week before Clara's birth. Asterisk, June 20th, 1955. Mrs. Whitmore says she'll take care of my baby if anything happens to me. She promised me. I don't trust her husband, but I believe she'll keep this promise. At least my child will have a home. At least she won't grow up in poverty or an orphanage. That's something, asterisk. Asterisk, I should have told James. I should have trusted our love to survive the truth. But it's too late now. I've cut him out of my life to protect him from my shame, and I'll never see him again. That's my punishment for being too afraid to fight back, too afraid to tell the truth, asterisk. Asterisk, if I don't survive this birth, I hope my daughter knows I loved her. I hope she has a better life than I did. I hope she's braver than I was. Asterisk. Clara closed the journal, overcome with grief for the mother she'd never known. Rose had been a victim who'd blamed herself, who thought she was protecting her loved ones by staying silent, who died without ever knowing that her silence had cost her everything. "I'm so sorry," Jennifer said quietly. "I know this must be incredibly painful." "It is," Clara said, wiping her eyes. "But it's also important. This is my mother's true story. This is what really happened. And it needs to be told, not just for her sake, but for all the other women like her who were victimized and silenced." Over the next few weeks, Clara threw herself into creating the museum. She worked with historians to document not just the Whitmore family's history, but the history of all the people who'd worked in the house over the generations, the cooks, maids, gardeners, and other domestic workers whose stories had been erased from the official narrative. One room would be dedicated to Rose Washington, displaying her letters, her diary, and photographs Clara had found. The exhibit would tell the truth about what had happened to her, the assault, the pregnancy, her death, and the decades of silence that followed. Another room would focus on Michael Washington, Clara's son. It would display his Navy service records, photographs from his brief life, and documentation of the accident that killed him and the cover-up that followed. Jackson had managed to get the full investigation files unsealed, and they were damning, showing clear negligence by 3 officers, all of whom had been protected rather than prosecuted. But Clara's vision for the museum went beyond her own family's story. She wanted it to be a place that documented the true history of Charleston, including the uncomfortable truths about how wealth was built on slavery and exploitation, how that exploitation continued even after slavery ended, and how powerful families had used their influence to hide their crimes and protect their reputations. The project drew both support and opposition. Many people in Charleston's black community embraced it, seeing it as long overdue recognition of stories that had been suppressed. But some of Charleston's old families were horrified, viewing it as an attack on the city's heritage. Richard was among the most vocal opponents. He gave interviews claiming Clara was rewriting history and slandering his family. He tried to organize a boycott of the museum. He even attempted to sue to prevent certain documents from being displayed, claiming they violated his privacy. But Judge Mitchell shut down his legal challenges, and public opinion was largely against him. The scandal of the will contest had exposed Richard as someone who'd threatened his own mother and covered up his half-sister's identity. Few people felt sympathetic to his claims of being victimized. 6 months after the court judgment, Clara received an unexpected visitor. Patricia Whitmore, Richard's wife, appeared at the mansion one afternoon, asking to speak with Clara privately. They sat in Margaret's study, Clara's study now, and Patricia looked around the room with sad nostalgia. "I spent a lot of time in this room," Patricia said quietly. "Margaret used to invite me here for tea, back when Richard and I were first married. She was kind to me, even though I came from a middle-class family and some people thought Richard was marrying beneath him." She looked at Clara. "I'm sorry. For how I've treated you, for how Richard has treated you, for all of it." Clara studied the older woman, trying to gauge her sincerity. "Why are you here, Patricia?" "Because I found something. Something Richard tried to hide from me." Patricia pulled a document from her purse. "These are bank records. Richard has been making payments to someone for years, large payments, always in cash, always carefully hidden from the main family accounts." Clara took the records and scanned them. The payments went back almost 30 years, regular monthly transfers to an account under a name she didn't recognize. "I did some investigating," Patricia continued. "That account belongs to a woman named Michelle Torres. She lives in Atlanta now, but 30 years ago, she worked as a secretary at Richard's law firm here in Charleston." Patricia's voice was tight with emotion. "Richard had an affair with her. She got pregnant. And he paid her off, monthly payments to support the child and keep her silent. I never knew. For 30 years, I never knew." Clara felt a strange mixture of sympathy for Patricia and anger at Richard's hypocrisy. He has another child. Besides the 3 you had together. A daughter. She's 29 years old now. Her name is Sarah. Patricia pulled out a photograph. I tracked her down. That's her with her mother. Clara looked at the photo. Sarah Torres had Richard's eyes and chin, unmistakably a Whitmore despite her mother's Hispanic heritage. Why are you telling me this? Clara asked. Because Richard spent years claiming you weren't really family, that you had no right to the Whitmore inheritance, that blood didn't matter if it wasn't legitimate or acknowledged. And all that time, he had a secret daughter of his own that he'd never acknowledged, never introduced to his family, never claimed as his own. Patricia's voice broke. He's a hypocrite. Everything he accused you of being, a manipulator, someone trying to extort money, someone with no real claim to the family, that's what he actually did. He paid Michelle to keep quiet. He denied his own daughter for 3 decades just to maintain his reputation. Does Sarah know about the Whitmore connection? She knows Richard is her father. But she doesn't know about the inheritance fight, about you, or about the fact that her father has another family he's never acknowledged her to. Patricia looked at Clara with determined eyes. I want to introduce you to her. I want her to know the truth. And I want Richard to face consequences for all his lies, not just the ones about you, but all of them. Over the next few weeks, Clara met with Michelle and Sarah Torres. They met in Atlanta, away from Charleston's gossip and judgment, in a quiet restaurant where they could talk privately. Michelle was 55 years old, still beautiful, with tired eyes that had seen too much. Sarah was a lawyer working for a civil rights organization, smart and passionate and completely unaware of the complexity of her Whitmore connections. Clara told them her story. She showed them the court documents, the DNA evidence, and the full history of Richard's lies and cover-ups. And then Patricia shared her discovery of Richard's secret payments. Sarah listened in shocked silence, then finally spoke. So my father, who never acknowledged me publicly, who paid my mother to keep me secret, who wouldn't even come to my college graduation because he was afraid someone might recognize him, that same man fought to deny you your inheritance because you weren't legitimate family. Yes, Clara said simply. That's. Sarah struggled to find words. That's beyond hypocritical. That's evil. Michelle took her daughter's hand. I'm sorry, Mija. I should have fought harder to make him acknowledge you. But I was young and scared, and he was powerful and convincing. He said if I made trouble, he'd destroy me. He'd claim I seduced him, that I was lying about him being your father, that I was trying to extort money. I believed him. Just like my mother was threatened, Clara said quietly. Just like every woman who's ever been victimized by powerful men who know the system will protect them. We were all scared, all isolated, all convinced we had no power against them. Sarah looked at Clara with new understanding. But you fought back. You survived his attempts to deny you and bury the truth. You won. I had help, Clara said. I had Margaret's documentation and legal protection. I had a good lawyer. And I had the privilege of age, I'm 68 years old. I've already survived the worst. What could Richard do to me that life hasn't already done? She looked at Sarah seriously. But you're young. You have a career, a life ahead of you. Going public about this could bring you unwanted attention, judgment, harassment. You need to think carefully about what you want to do. Sarah's jaw set with determination. I want the truth to come out. All of it. I want people to know that Richard Whitmore spent 30 years paying my mother to keep me secret while simultaneously denying his own sister and claiming she wasn't legitimate family. I want his hypocrisy exposed. Are you sure? Michelle asked worriedly. Once this is public, it can't be taken back. I'm sure. I've spent my whole life being a secret, being hidden, being ashamed of circumstances I didn't create. No more. Sarah looked at Clara. You showed me that truth is more important than comfort. Justice is more important than reputation. I want to stand with you. 2 weeks later, Sarah Torres held a press conference in Charleston. Standing beside Clara, Patricia, and her mother Michelle, she told her story. My name is Sarah Torres, and I'm Richard Whitmore's daughter. For 29 years, I've been kept secret, paid off, hidden, denied. My father gave my mother money to stay silent, to never claim him publicly, to never acknowledge our relationship. He came to the hospital the day I was born, then disappeared from my life, appearing only for occasional secret visits where he'd make sure no one saw us together. She gestured to Clara. While my father was keeping me hidden, he was fighting in court to deny this woman, his own half-sister, her rightful inheritance. He claimed she wasn't legitimate family. He said blood didn't matter if it wasn't properly acknowledged. He said she had no right to the Whitmore name or fortune. And all the while, he had a daughter he'd never acknowledged, never claimed, never given his name to. The reporters went wild, shouting questions. The story exploded across Charleston and then went national, the story of Richard Whitmore's hypocrisy, of the secret daughter he denied while fighting to disinherit his secret sister. Richard's reputation, already damaged by the will contest, was completely destroyed. His law firm asked him to retire. His social connections evaporated. His children, the 3 legitimate ones from his marriage to Patricia, were horrified and ashamed of their father. Patricia filed for divorce. And Clara found herself with not just recognition of her own connection to the Whitmore family, but a new sister, Sarah, who shared her experience of being denied and hidden. The museum opened 1 year after Margaret's death, on a cool October day. Hundreds of people attended the opening ceremony, veterans who'd known Clara from her volunteer work, members of Charleston's black community, historians and educators, and even some members of Charleston's old families who were ready to face their own complicated histories. Clara stood at the entrance to the mansion, ready to give the opening speech. Beside her stood Sarah Torres, who'd moved to Charleston and was helping run the museum's legal advocacy program for families seeking to uncover hidden histories. Welcome to the Rose Washington Heritage Center, Clara began. This building was once a symbol of hidden truth and buried history. Today, it becomes a symbol of truth revealed and justice served. She gestured to the building behind her. Inside these walls, you'll find the true history of Charleston, not the sanitized version that appears in tourist brochures, but the real, complicated, often painful truth. You'll learn about the people who worked in houses like this, who were exploited and silenced. You'll learn about women like my mother Rose, who was victimized and blamed for her own victimization. You'll learn about the systems of power that protected perpetrators and punished victims. Clara paused, looking out at the diverse crowd. But you'll also learn about resistance, survival, and the power of truth. You'll learn that it's never too late to make things right, to acknowledge what was wrong, to give voice to those who were silenced. Justice delayed is still justice worth fighting for. She turned to unveil a plaque beside the entrance. It read, Asterisk, in memory of Rose Washington, 1938 to 1955, and all those whose stories were hidden. May the truth they were denied in life finally be told in death. May justice long delayed finally be served. Asterisk. The crowd applauded as Clara and Sarah cut the ribbon, officially opening the museum. People filed inside, moving through rooms that told stories of struggle and survival, oppression and resistance. In Rose Washington's room, visitors learned about the young woman who dreamed of becoming a teacher, who'd loved a soldier named James, whose life had been destroyed by a powerful man's violence and a society that blamed victims instead of perpetrators. In Michael Washington's room, they learned about the young sailor whose death should have been prevented, whose family never got justice, and whose story represented so many other military families whose losses were caused by negligence and covered up by the powerful. And in the main gallery, they learned about the broader history, about how families like the Whitmores had built their fortunes on slavery and exploitation, how that exploitation had continued even after slavery ended, and how power had been used to hide crimes and protect reputations while victims suffered in silence. That evening, after the museum closed and the crowds dispersed, Clara stood alone in Margaret's study. She'd kept this room largely as it had been, with Margaret's desk and books and the view of Charleston Harbor that the old woman had loved. She thought about Margaret's letter, about the old woman's regret and her efforts to make amends. She thought about Rose, who died at 18 with her dreams destroyed. She thought about James, who died never knowing what had happened to the woman he loved. She thought about Michael, whose life had been cut short by negligence and whose death had been covered up by the powerful. And she thought about Sarah, the sister she'd never known she had, who'd also spent her life being denied and hidden. So much pain. So many secrets. So many lives damaged or destroyed by people who valued reputation over truth, power over justice. But now, finally, the truth was public. The secrets were revealed. Justice had been served, not perfectly, not completely, but meaningfully. Clara's phone buzzed. It was a text from Sarah, thank you for standing with me. Thank you for showing me that truth matters more than comfort. I'm proud to be your sister. Clara smiled through her tears and typed back, I'm proud to call you sister. Rose would be proud of both of us. She looked around the study one final time, then turned off the lights and locked the door. Tomorrow, she'd be back here, continuing the work of documenting hidden histories and giving voice to the silenced. But tonight, she'd go home to her own small house, not the mansion, which she'd given to the museum, but a comfortable place near the water where she could finally rest. The battle was over. The truth was told. Justice had been served. And Clara Washington, daughter of Rose, mother of Michael, sister of Richard and Sarah, heir to the Whitmore fortune, had finally, at 68 years old, claimed her full identity and her rightful place in history. Not as a secret. Not as a shame. Not as someone to be denied or hidden. But as herself, fully and completely, with nothing left to hide. The Rose Washington Heritage Center had been open for 6 months when Clara received a letter that would change everything one final time. It arrived in a plain envelope, postmarked from a nursing home in rural Georgia, written in shaky handwriting that spoke of advanced age. Dear Ms. Washington. My name is Helen Coleman. I am 92 years old and in poor health. I saw the news reports about your museum and your mother Rose Washington. I believe I knew your mother when she was young, and I have information I think you need to hear before I die. I am the aunt of James Coleman, the young man Rose was in love with. I have letters and photographs that I think belong to you. Please visit me if you can. I don't have much time left, and this burden has been heavy for too long. Sincerely. Helen Coleman, Clara's heart raced as she read the letter. James Coleman's aunt. The man her mother had loved. She immediately called Jackson Morrison and arranged to visit the nursing home the following week. The Magnolia Gardens nursing home was a modest facility in rural Georgia, about 2 hours from Charleston. Clara made the drive with Sarah, who'd insisted on coming along. The two sisters had grown close over the past months, bonding over their shared experience of being denied and their commitment to truth-telling. Helen Coleman was a tiny woman, no more than 90 pounds, with papery skin and clouded eyes that had once been bright blue. She sat in a wheelchair in her small room, surrounded by photographs and mementos from a long life. Ms. Washington. Helen's voice was weak but clear. Thank you for coming. Please, sit down. I have things to tell you, and I'm not sure how many days I have left. Clara and Sarah sat, and Helen began her story. James was my nephew, my sister's youngest boy. He was a sweet child, kind and gentle, not cut out for military life but determined to serve his country. When he came back from overseas, he was different, more serious, more mature. But he was happy because he was going to marry Rose Washington, the girl he'd been writing to for 2 years while he was deployed. Helen's eyes filled with tears. Then something happened. Rose stopped answering his letters. James was devastated. He tried to find her, went to her family's home, but they wouldn't tell him anything. They just said she didn't want to see him anymore and that he needed to leave her alone. James didn't understand. He couldn't believe Rose would just stop loving him with no explanation. My mother didn't stop loving him, Clara said gently. She was raped by the man she worked for. She was ashamed and thought James deserved better than someone who'd been violated. She was trying to protect him. Helen nodded slowly. I suspected something like that. James became depressed, started drinking. He was in a car accident about a year after Rose stopped writing. The police said it was just an accident, but I always wondered if part of him wanted to die. He'd lost the woman he loved and didn't know why. I'm so sorry, Clara said. My mother loved him. She wrote about him in her diary. She wanted to marry him. But she was scared and ashamed and thought she was doing the right thing by pushing him away. I know, Helen said. Because I received a letter. 2 weeks before Rose died giving birth to you, she wrote to me. Helen reached for a shoebox on the table beside her wheelchair. With trembling hands, she opened it and pulled out a yellowed envelope. Read it, she said, handing it to Clara. Clara opened the envelope with shaking hands and pulled out several pages of careful handwriting. Asterisk, Dear Mrs. Coleman. You don't know me, but I knew your nephew James. We were in love, and we planned to marry when he came home from the army. I'm writing to you because I need someone to know the truth, and I can't bring myself to tell James directly, asterisk. Asterisk, I stopped writing to James because something terrible happened to me. The man I work for, Richard Whitmore, assaulted me. Multiple times. I couldn't stop him, he's powerful and I'm just a colored girl working in his house. If I accused him, no one would believe me. They'd say I was lying or trying to get money from him, asterisk. Asterisk, I'm pregnant with his child. Mrs. Whitmore says she'll take care of the baby if anything happens to me during the birth. I'm scared, Mrs. Coleman. I'm only 18 years old and I don't know if I'll survive this, asterisk. Asterisk, I want you to know that I love James. I still love him. I think about him every day. But I can't marry him now. How could I face him knowing what was done to me? How could I ask him to accept another man's child, conceived in violence? He deserves better. He deserves a woman who hasn't been ruined, asterisk. Asterisk, if I die, please tell James that I loved him until my last breath. Tell him I'm sorry for pushing him away. Tell him I wish things could have been different. And tell him that our baby, the child we should have had together, would have been loved and wanted and raised with all the joy we planned for our life together, asterisk. Asterisk, but this baby I'm carrying now. I don't know how to love a child that came from violence. I don't know if I can look at this baby without seeing its father and what he did to me. Mrs. Whitmore promises to care for the child, and maybe that's better. Maybe a baby born from such ugliness deserves a fresh start with people who can love her without remembering how she came to be, asterisk. Asterisk, I'm so tired, Mrs. Coleman. I'm so tired of being afraid. I'm so tired of carrying this shame that isn't even mine. I'm so tired of living in a world where men like Richard Whitmore can destroy a girl's life and face no consequences while that girl loses everything, her dreams, her love, her future, asterisk. Asterisk, please tell James I'm sorry. And please pray for me and for the baby I'm carrying. We're both victims of a man's violence, and neither of us asked for this, asterisk. Asterisk with love and sorrow. Rose Washington, asterisk. Clara read through tears streaming down her face. Sarah was crying too, and even Helen had tears running down her wrinkled cheeks. I received this letter the day before James died, Helen said. I was going to tell him, to explain why Rose had pushed him away, to give him closure. But he died before I could. The car accident happened that night. She paused. I've always wondered if somehow he knew. If somehow he sensed that something terrible had happened to Rose and he couldn't save her. Why didn't you come forward? Clara asked. Why didn't you tell anyone what Rose wrote? Helen's face filled with shame. Because I was a coward. I was a white woman in 1950s Georgia, and Rose's letter accused a powerful white man of raping a black girl. Who would have believed her? Who would have believed me? I told myself it was too late anyway. Rose was dead, James was dead, and bringing it up would only cause more pain. She looked at Clara with desperate eyes. I was wrong to stay silent. I see that now. I've carried the guilt of that silence for 68 years. Clara reached out and took Helen's frail hand. You weren't the one who did wrong, Helen. Richard Whitmore did wrong. The society that protected him did wrong. My mother was a victim, and she shouldn't have had to carry that shame alone. But you were also a victim of that same society, taught to stay silent, to protect powerful men, to accept that some people's lives matter less than others. I'm sorry, Helen whispered. I'm so sorry I didn't speak up. I forgive you, Clara said. And I know my mother would forgive you too. You're speaking up now. That's what matters. Helen pulled another item from the shoebox, a photograph of a young man in an army uniform, smiling at the camera with bright eyes and an open, honest face. That's James. He was a good man. He would have been a wonderful father to you if things had been different. Clara looked at the photo of the man who should have been her father, the man her mother had loved, the man who'd loved Rose in return, the man who died of a broken heart without ever knowing the truth. Can I keep this? Clara asked. It's yours, Helen said. Everything in this box is yours. The letters James wrote to Rose, the photograph, and Rose's letter to me. They're part of your history. Your mother's story. Clara carefully gathered the contents of the shoebox, precious pieces of a love story destroyed by violence, precious evidence of her mother's truth. There's one more thing, Helen said. In Rose's letter, she talked about not knowing if she could love a baby conceived in violence. But Clara, you need to know something. Your mother was wrong about that. What do you mean? I knew a woman who worked in the Whitmore household after Rose died. She was a nurse who helped care for you when you were an infant. Years later, after I'd received Rose's letter, I sought this woman out. I needed to know what had happened to Rose's baby. Helen's voice strengthened with emotion. That nurse told me that Rose didn't die right away after giving birth. She lived for several hours. And during those hours, she held you. She looked at you. And she cried and told Mrs. Whitmore that she'd been wrong, that you were beautiful, that you were innocent, that you deserved to be loved. Clara felt her heart break open. My mother loved me. Yes. The nurse said Rose's last words were about you. She said, take care of my baby. Love her for me. Tell her someday that her mother loved her even though I won't be there to show her. The nurse said it was the most heartbreaking thing she'd ever witnessed, a young girl dying but using her last moments to make sure her baby would be cared for. Clara broke down completely, sobbing into Sarah's shoulder. For 68 years, she'd wondered if her mother had loved her or resented her. She'd read Rose's diary entries about not knowing if she could love a child conceived in violence, and she'd wondered if Rose had looked at her newborn baby with hatred or horror. Now she knew the truth. Rose had loved her. Her mother's last living moments had been spent holding her, looking at her, loving her. "Thank you," Clara whispered to Helen. "Thank you for telling me that. Thank you for keeping these letters safe. Thank you for finally speaking your truth." "I should have spoken it 68 years ago," Helen said. "But at least I've spoken it before I die. At least you know now that your mother loved you. That James would have loved you if he'd lived. That you were wanted and cherished, even if your conception came from violence." Clara stayed with Helen for another hour, listening to stories about James, his kindness, his humor, the dreams he'd had for his life with Rose. Helen shared photographs of the Coleman family, giving Clara a glimpse of the paternal family she'd never known, the family she should have belonged to if James had lived and married Rose as they'd planned. When it was time to leave, Clara hugged the frail old woman gently. "Thank you for your courage, Helen. Thank you for finally letting the truth come out." "No," Helen said. "Thank you for having the courage to tell Rose's story publicly. If you hadn't opened that museum, if you hadn't fought for truth, I would have taken these letters to my grave. You gave me permission to finally speak. You showed me it's never too late for truth." On the drive back to Charleston, Clara and Sarah were quiet for a long time, processing everything they'd learned. Finally, Sarah spoke. "You know what strikes me about all of this? How many women stayed silent. Rose stayed silent about what Richard Whitmore did to her. My mother stayed silent about Richard being my father. Margaret stayed silent for decades. Helen stayed silent about Rose's letter. All these women, carrying these truths alone, convinced that speaking up would only make things worse. That's what powerful men count on," Clara said. "They count on women being too afraid to speak, too ashamed to come forward, too convinced that no one will believe them. And for generations, they were right. Women who spoke up were called liars, destroyers of families, opportunists trying to extort money. So most women stayed silent, and the powerful men faced no consequences. But things are changing," Sarah said. "Your mother couldn't speak up safely in 1955. Helen couldn't speak up in 1956. But you spoke up in 2023, and people believed you. The court believed you. The public believed you. Justice was served. Not for everyone," Clara said sadly. "Not for my mother. Not for James. Not for Michael. Justice came too late for them. But not too late for us," Sarah countered. "Not too late for the next generation. Your museum is teaching people to tell the truth, to confront hidden histories, to stop protecting powerful people who do terrible things. That matters, Clara. That changes things." When they returned to Charleston, Clara added Rose's letters and the photograph of James to the museum exhibit. She created a new display telling the full story of Rose and James's love, the violence that destroyed it, and the baby born from that violence who carried both her mother's trauma and her mother's strength. The story resonated deeply with visitors. Women came to the museum and shared their own stories of assault, of being silenced, of carrying secrets and shame that weren't theirs to carry. The museum became not just a place to learn history, but a place where people could speak their own truths and be believed. One afternoon, 3 months after the visit to Helen Coleman, Clara received another unexpected visitor. A woman in her 70s, well-dressed and dignified, asked to speak with Clara privately. "My name is Catherine Whitmore," the woman said. "I'm Richard Whitmore, the second sister. Your father's sister. I suppose that makes me your aunt." Clara stared at her in shock. She'd had no idea Richard II had a sister who was still alive. I didn't come to the will contest, Catherine continued. I haven't spoken to my nephew Richard in 20 years. But I heard about the museum, about Rose's story, and I felt I needed to come speak with you. Why? Catherine's face was drawn with old pain. Because I knew. Not about Rose specifically, but about my brother's proclivities. He had a pattern of pursuing young women who worked for him, women who had no power to refuse him, who were afraid of losing their jobs or being accused of seduction. Rose wasn't his only victim. She was just the one who got pregnant. Clara felt sick. How many? I don't know for certain. At least 5 or 6 that I knew about over the years. Probably more that I didn't. Catherine's voice was heavy with guilt. I tried to confront him once, back in the 1960s. He laughed at me. Said I was being hysterical, that these women were willing participants who knew what they were getting into. He said he was doing them a favor by giving them attention and good jobs. He truly believed he was entitled to them. Why didn't you report him? To who? This was the 1960s in Charleston, South Carolina. My brother was a wealthy white man with political connections. The women he targeted were black or poor or both. Who would have believed them? Who would have taken their word over his? Catherine paused. I tried to warn women away from working for him. I tried to help some of them find other jobs. But I never went to the police or made a public accusation. And I've lived with the guilt of that silence for over 50 years. Clara studied this woman who was technically her aunt, another person who'd known terrible truths and stayed silent to protect a powerful man. Why are you telling me this now? Because I'm dying. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. I have maybe 3 months left. Catherine met Clara's eyes. And because I saw what you did, how you forced the truth into the light, how you refused to let your mother's story be buried. You were brave in a way I never was. And I want to give you something before I die. She pulled a folder from her purse and handed it to Clara. Inside were documents, employment records from Richard Whitmore II's various businesses, showing dozens of young women hired as secretaries or domestic workers. Several names had been circled in red. These are the women I know or suspect were my brother's victims. Most of them are probably dead by now, this was 50, 60 years ago. But some may still be alive. And maybe they have daughters or granddaughters who deserve to know their mother's stories, just like you deserve to know Rose's story. Clara looked through the list of names, feeling the weight of decades of buried truths. What do you want me to do with this? Whatever you think is right. Investigate if you want. Tell their stories if you can find them. Or just know the truth yourself, that Rose wasn't alone, that the violence done to her was part of a pattern, that your father was a predator who used his power to hurt vulnerable women for decades. Catherine's voice broke. I should have stopped him. I should have spoken up. I failed those women, just like I failed Rose. You were raised in a society that taught you to protect men like your brother, Clara said gently. You were taught that women's pain mattered less than men's reputations. That's not your fault. Maybe not. But silence is still a choice. And I chose wrong. Catherine stood to leave. I'm sorry, Clara. I'm sorry for what my brother did to your mother. I'm sorry I didn't protect you or acknowledge you. I'm sorry for all of it. After Catherine left, Clara sat alone in her office, looking at the list of names. More women. More victims. More stories buried by shame and power and societal complicity. She called Jackson Morrison and Sarah into her office and showed them the list. We need to investigate this, Sarah said immediately. If any of these women are still alive, they deserve to have their stories acknowledged. And if they have children who don't know their true fathers, they deserve to know the truth just like you did. Over the next months, Clara, Sarah, and Jackson worked to track down the women on Catherine's list. Most were deceased, victims of poverty, violence, or simply the passage of time. But they found 3 who were still alive, now in their 70s and 80s. Each had a similar story. Young women from poor families, hired by Richard Whitmore II, assaulted repeatedly, threatened into silence. 2 had gotten pregnant, 1 had miscarried, 1 had given birth to a child she'd raised alone, never revealing the father's identity. That child, now a woman in her 50s named Denise Thompson, was shocked to learn the truth about her parentage. She agreed to DNA testing, which confirmed she was Richard Whitmore II's daughter. Which meant Clara had another sister. And so did Richard Whitmore III, who was horrified to discover his father had yet another secret child. The revelations kept coming. Each truth led to more truths. Each story connected to other stories. The pattern of abuse and concealment that had seemed like individual tragedies were revealed to be systematic, a powerful man using his position to exploit vulnerable women for decades, enabled by a society that valued his reputation over their safety. The museum added a new exhibit documenting all of it. Not just Rose's story, but the stories of all Richard Whitmore II's victims who could be identified. The exhibit was called The Silence Breakers, and it honored these women who'd been forced into silence during their lives but whose truths were finally being told after their deaths. The exhibit drew national attention. News outlets covered the story of the Charleston Museum that was documenting not just slavery-era abuse but the continuation of that abuse into the 20th century. Historians began investigating other prominent Charleston families, finding similar patterns of exploitation and concealment. It was painful. It was controversial. But it was necessary. 1 year after the museum opened, Clara stood before a crowd gathered for a special memorial service. They were dedicating a memorial garden on the museum grounds, with plaques honoring Rose Washington and all the other women whose stories had been uncovered. Catherine Whitmore had died 2 months earlier, her last month spent helping Clara document the full extent of her brother's crimes. Despite her guilt and regret, she'd found some measure of peace in finally telling the truth. Helen Coleman had died as well, passing quietly in her sleep shortly after sharing Rose's letters. She'd lived long enough to see Rose's story publicly acknowledged and honored. Clara stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd that had gathered. Sarah stood beside her, as did Denise Thompson, Clara's newly discovered sister. Patricia Whitmore was there too, having fully separated herself from Richard and become an advocate for truth-telling about family secrets. We gather here today to honor women who were silenced in life but whose voices were finally hearing in death, Clara began. My mother Rose Washington. James Coleman, who loved her and died without knowing what had happened to her. Helen Coleman, who carried the burden of Rose's truth for 68 years. Catherine Whitmore, who knew her brother's crimes but didn't know how to stop them. And all the other women, named and unnamed, known and unknown, who suffered abuse by powerful men and were forced into silence by societies that valued reputation over justice. She paused, looking at the names carved into the memorial plaques. For too long, these women's stories were treated as shameful secrets to be buried and denied. They were blamed for their own victimization. They were told their pain mattered less than their abusers' reputations. They were convinced that speaking up would only make things worse. Clara's voice strengthened. But we're here today to say, your stories matter. Your pain matters. Your truths deserve to be told. And we will not participate in your silence any longer. She turned to unveil the central memorial, a bronze statue of a woman reading a book to a child. The woman's face was based on the only photograph of Rose Washington that existed. The child in her lap represented Clara, and also every child born into difficult circumstances, every child who carries trauma they didn't ask for. The inscription at the base read, "*In memory of Rose Washington and all who were silenced. May our voices carry their truths. May our courage honor their suffering. May our justice, however delayed, vindicate their lives. The truth will set you free." John 8:32". The crowd was silent as Clara stepped back from the memorial. Then, slowly, people began to applaud, not the polite golf clap of formal ceremonies, but genuine, sustained applause that spoke of emotion and recognition and gratitude. After the ceremony, Clara stood in the memorial garden alone, looking at her mother's name carved in bronze. She thought about Rose's short life, 18 years filled with dreams and love and then violence and death. She thought about the pain Rose had carried, the shame she'd felt, the fear that had kept her silent. "I told your story, Mama," Clara whispered. "I made sure people know what happened to you. I made sure they know you were a victim, not a collaborator. I made sure they know you loved me and James and that you deserved so much better than what you got." The breeze rustled through the garden, and Clara felt something like peace settle over her. The battle was over. The truth was told. Justice, imperfect and incomplete, but real, had been served. She thought about the inheritance Margaret had left her, not just the money and the house, but the responsibility to tell the truth, to honor the silenced, to fight for justice even when it came decades late. She'd fulfilled that responsibility. The museum would continue telling these stories long after Clara was gone. Future generations would learn the truth about Charleston's history, not the sanitized version, but the real, complicated, often painful truth. And maybe, slowly, the silence that had protected powerful men for generations would finally be broken. Maybe women would feel empowered to speak their truths. Maybe families would stop hiding their secrets. Maybe justice would come faster for the next generation than it had for Clara's. As the sun set over Charleston Harbor, casting golden light across the memorial garden, Clara felt the weight of 68 years of secrets finally lift completely. She was free, free from the lies, free from the shame, free from the half-life she'd lived for so long. She was Clara Washington, daughter of Rose, daughter of Richard Whitmore II, sister of Richard III and Sarah and Denise, mother of Michael, keeper of truths, teller of silent stories. And her life, however painful and complicated, had mattered. Her mother's life had mattered. All their lives had mattered. And now, finally, the world knew it too. The plantation mistress had left her fortune to a woman the world had called a slave, a servant, a nobody. But Margaret had known better. She'd left her fortune to her stepdaughter, her husband's daughter, the rightful heir to the Whitmore name, a woman who'd survived everything the world could throw at her and emerged with her dignity intact and her truth unshakable. And in doing so, Margaret had helped set that truth free. Justice, delayed for 68 years but finally, blessedly served.